Excellent. I'm going to welcome everybody. So I'm Glenn Cohen. I'm a deputy dean and professor at Harvard Law School and also the faculty director of the Petrie-Flom Center. And we're so glad to be hosting this with our friends at the Solomon Center to talk about this great book. I've got a copy right here. You should get your copy off the presses soon. So I'm going to start with just a few housekeeping words. So please, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature found in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A feature, not the chat. You can join the conversation by also online by submitting questions to Twitter or, as it's known now, X at Petrie-Flom. We'll be monitoring that at Petrie-Flom. We'll be sharing a fully captioned video of this event with all registrants within 1 to 2 weeks. And if you have any technical issues, please email us at petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu. We'll be monitoring that. We'll try to do our darndest to help you. So now I want to just kind of acknowledge some of the people that helped this event and this book come together. I want to acknowledge Abby Gluck, who you'll be hearing from shortly, but also my other co-editors, Katie Crashall, who's now an assistant professor at Northeastern, and Carmel Shachar, who has gone on to be an assistant clinical professor running our health law clinic right here at Harvard, as well as all the amazing authors in the book, and you'll hear from a few of them today. I also want to thank our terrific research assistants, Kat, Nina, Daniel, Emily, Catherine, Samantha, and also acknowledge the Petrie-Flom team, Susanna, Laura, Chloe, and Lisa, as well as Laurel at the Solomon Center team from helping making this event really a success and also helping the book become a real success. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to my friend, Abby Gluck from Yale. Go ahead, Abby.
I'll mute. Thank you, Glenn. It is such a pleasure to be here with you, and I have the distinct honor of introducing Ashish. So I'm going to say a little bit about the book when we've had our initial conversation. But first, I want to introduce Ashish Jha. So Dr. Jha is the dean of Brown University School of Public Health. From 2022 to 2023, he served in the White House in the lead role in the nation's COVID-19 response. He was the coordinator of the White House response team. I'm someone who previously served on that team, and as someone who is on that team, I cannot overemphasize what a central role the coordinator plays in the White House and how challenging and multifaceted that role is. Among many other initiatives related to the COVID response, Dr. Jha worked on vaccine development and guided the nation through the end of the public health emergency. Before joining the Brown School of Public Health, he was professor at Harvard School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School, and he led the Harvard Global Health Institute from 2014 to 2020. And throughout the first couple of years of the pandemic, before joining the White House, as you all must know, he was a very familiar face on television. We've all discovered that he has an amazing talent for translating complex scientific issues to a public eager for information. I believe he even stopped by on Sesame Street at one point to talk vaccination, which is probably the coolest thing of all. Dr. Jha's specialty is internal medicine. He attended Harvard Medical School, Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Jha, first and foremost, thank you for your service to our country and all that you did in just such an important role during a historic time. And second, far less important, but still important to us, we're so honored to have you here for this official launch of the book to talk about COVID's legal legacy. So with that, I'm going to invite Glenn to come back on the screen so we can pepper you with questions. But first, Dr. Jha, did you want to offer some opening comments? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Abby and Glenn, and thank you for putting this book together. And I want to say also, Abby, thank you for your service. I think you left just as I was coming in, and your legacy on the team was very, very clear. So I want to say thank you for all the great work you did. You know, it's interesting when I think about this once in a century public health event. And by the way, when I say once in a century, I want to be very clear. No one should think we're going to be able to wait another century before it happens again. It's just that it's been about 100 years since we had something quite this devastating. It affected pretty much every aspect of society. And as I went through this book and thought about the big topics that this pandemic affected, from our healthcare system to our information landscape, to how it disproportionately impacted different populations, the elderly, people of color, people who are poor, all the ways in which it reshaped government. Obviously, the global impact. It's all here in the book. And the book really, I think, does a very comprehensive job of trying to tackle this very, very complex event that we all just lived through. And it gets to the experience I had at the White House. Sort of a funny thing, the White House COVID-19 response coordinator, not really sure what that means. It turns out that the US government has its hands through policy, through purchasing, through direct engagement with almost every aspect of this pandemic response. And coordinating that across the US government is extremely complex because the US government is not a single entity. I mean, the executive branch has one leader, Joe Biden, but lots and lots and lots of different constituencies. And how the CDC sees an issue is often different than how OSHA sees it, which is often different than how the Department of Commerce might see it. And trying to come up with a single coherent response was a really important part of doing that work. But it was also very clear that without that coherent response, and I will argue that in 2020, we did not have a coherent response, the country was much worse off for it. Let me just finish off by saying, I think there's a whole series of lessons that we have learned. I worry, since we are unlikely to ever have a deep formal inquiry into what happened. I use that term because the UK is doing a formal inquiry on what happened. I think that is unlikely to happen here in the United States. A lot of the key lessons will be lost. And I think it's books like this one that begins to capture a lot of those things so that we learn from them and we make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. When we have our next big biosecurity threat, natural, man-made, we will make more mistakes. But at least we can make sure we do is commit to not making the exact same ones. And I worry that we've learned a lot of lessons, but there are a lot of important lessons that we have not learned as well as we need to. So with that, let me stop because I know you guys have questions and I'd rather just get into a discussion. So over to you, Abby or Glenn, or however you guys want to do it.
Glenn, who would you like to start the firing squad? Okay, I will start.
Abby, you go first. You go first.
So I just, I know this, but I think it'd be really helpful for our listeners if you could sort of set the stage. When you came in spring of 2022, where were things and what were sort of the biggest challenges that you faced coming in?
Yeah. So I got the call from the White House just as the massive Omicron wave of January of 2022 was receding. And I came in, I think I started the early April, but basically by mid-March, kind of everything was sunset. And by that time, things were getting better from the big wave, but we were already starting to see a new wave getting going with new variants. I think the biggest thing I would say about that moment was there was a small group of people who, after the big Omicron wave, sort of were done. They were like, no more, I don't want to deal with this anymore, and we're ready to move on. Those were both Americans, but also policymakers who were already saying, it's time to end the public health emergency, the Omicron wave is over. There was also, and to me, the hardest part of that moment was the uncertainty. No one had predicted Omicron 4 months earlier. And what we didn't know was, are we going to have more of these crazy variants completely out of left field, or are we settling into a new normal? By the way, I would argue we still don't know the answer to that question with any definitiveness, though we have more experience. So it was a moment of a lot of uncertainty. That was one. Second, I think we also had new tools coming into play. We had a lot of treatments, and yet people weren't using them. And you also had this sense that that there were really big challenges from a policy point of view. We still had mask mandates in place for national travel or for interstate travel. We had just a series of policies in place that we needed to think about. When do we unravel them? How do we do it? How do we do it in a way that's not disruptive? So it was, I would say it was both a period of a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenges. And it was obviously an extraordinary privilege to try to serve at that moment, to try to get the country through that period.
Thanks, Ashish. So I'm going to ask you now, putting on the hindsight vision as 2020 sort of goggles on, which is, of course, you hate when people talk about that when it's your stuff you do, but asking you to do that and to be kind about it before February 2020. So the period before February 2020, before really COVID really explodes here in the United States. Are there one or two things you wish the US had done before that would have made us better prepared for the events that occurred?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest failure, and it's hard to pick one because there were many, but if you have to say what's the one kind of almost original sin of the pandemic response in the US, It's a two-parter, but they're the same thing in some ways. It was a lack of a surveillance system and a lack of our ability to build up diagnostics quickly. I actually think this set us off into the eventual politicization that we saw, all of the problems that followed. And let me explain why. Look, in February, March of 2020, you could see the ERs and the hospitals completely overwhelmed in New York. And the response of shutting down society, shutting down most of the activity, made a lot of sense at that moment. And when President Trump did that, that made sense. The problem was that you had people living in Montana and Mississippi who found themselves shut down, and they looked around and there was no COVID around. And for them, this felt like this made no sense. And I do think those were the seeds of eventually people beginning to doubt that COVID was a real problem. And imagine we had a strong surveillance system which could have easily identified that, hey, we've got a lot of COVID in New York, a lot in Boston, some in Detroit, some in New Orleans, but nothing in Mississippi and almost nothing in Montana. And so let's do much more targeted approaches. It would have made an enormous difference. That's sort of the technology behind that surveillance system existed. We have it much better now than we did then. And then our inability to ramp up testing, which would have been the other part of it, for a variety of reasons that are largely not technical, but much more policy. I think that combination of things really killed us, and we have got to make sure that we never have that again.
So let's fast forward now to where we are today. You know, we had hindsight and looking ahead. From your perch now, having left the government and had a little time to maybe sleep and reflect, you know, what do you think are the most critical things that we have to do over the next 5 years to be prepared for the next pandemic?
Yeah. So look, and it's interesting because when I was at the White House was when we saw the explosion of monkeypox, now called mpox. In some ways, that was an attempt at we got to play the same playbook. In my mind, there are two broad sets of things we need to be thinking. There is the sort of biomedical, classically talked about as medical countermeasures, vaccines, treatments, diagnostics, throw in surveillance into that. There's a bunch of infrastructure, a bunch of really important work on how you execute. Everybody knows that when you get a new agent, you got to build up diagnostics. Like that's not some big insight. There's a series of things that prevent the US from doing it as effectively and quickly as it needs to be. And I would argue we still have not fixed those things. And so we have got to fix those things. We have got to make it super easy to build up diagnostics the moment we see a new pathogen, natural, man-made, whatever. That is one important set of things, the medical countermeasures. The second is much more sociological, and it's much more about the information landscape. It's much more about building trust. And I think one of the things that absolutely needs to happen over the next 3 to 5 years is we've got to start rebuilding some trust in institutions, because institutions are going to be absolutely central to any future response, whether it's government, universities, other types of religious institutions. The loss of faith in these institutions means that even if we come up with the best medical countermeasures, fantastic surveillance, great tests, great vaccines, people aren't going to use them. That's going to make any kind of pandemic response much, much harder.
So obviously we're lawyers who are running this event, and as lawyers, we're always obsessed with federalism, as were many of the authors in this book. I'm curious, Ashish, from your bird's eye view of the work you were doing, how you feel about the relationship between states and the federal government when it comes to public health emergencies, how it played out, and how you, in your ideal world, you'd like it to play out.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm almost nervous to say this, but I will say it, and people can be mad at me. I like the federalism structure that we have. I like the fact that there's a lot of autonomy at state level. Look, to be honest, there were times at the White House when I wish that the policies we were setting at the federal government level, that states would follow. Sometimes that happened, sometimes it didn't. Some states did, some states didn't. That is the reality. The flip side, I remind my friends, especially my friends on the left, who often tend not to like this and say, we want a single national federal response, is, in April, President Trump wanted to end all restrictions and open everything up. And states had autonomy. Michigan was like, no, we're not doing that. I like that. I like the fact that you had states being able to say, we want to go in a different direction. And, so this is a double-edged sword. It definitely has complexity. It makes any federal coordinated effort much, much harder. I always reminded people, often people would call me and say, why aren't you demanding a national X, national mask mandate, national whatever? And I reminded people that the federal government doesn't have that kind of power. And sometimes that's frustrating. And sometimes it's a relief. So that's maybe a bit of a, kind of a wishy-washy answer. But I, at the end of the day, appreciate the federalism we have and think there's a lot more upside than a lot of people give it credit for.
Yeah, I can resonate. That resonates with my experience as well. So thank you for saying that. Before I ask you the next question, I want to shout out to our wonderful coordinator, Susanna, just to invite anyone who has a question for Dr. Jha to put it in the chat, because we're going to take questions for him before he jumps off. Then we go on to the rest of our panel. So you have about 3 minutes to throw some questions in the Q&A if you want us to elevate those questions. But I'll ask a question while we're reading, which is, hopefully we've got a lot of students who are watching this, both public health students and law students. And it'd be great now that you're back in academia to think about, what do you really want the public health students to think about or to learn or, to be focusing on given your experience in the pandemic? And if you have thoughts about telling the lawyers what role they serve and how they can be helpful, that would be great.
Yeah, let me start with this. I actually can go either way, but let me start with the lawyers. Just because we're both lawyers and a lot of friends who are lawyers. Lawyers, I found in the pandemic, I'm going to talk about my experience at the White House because I think that's the place where I interacted with them most. I found certainly White House counsel, lawyers at a lot of the agencies, extraordinarily helpful in navigating what were really complex waters. I mean, I described the difficulty of like federal government versus state government on public health. It's also true with like rules and laws, right? Like what can the federal government do versus what can states do? And then it also shows up with like different branches of the US government. So we had a policy in place that we were actually on our way to pulling down at that moment on mask mandates on airplanes. And then a federal judge decided that that was, beyond the CDC's authority. And what I loved in engaging with the legal team at HHS and the White House counsel and DOJ was thinking through not just the legal issues and the legal arguments, which they were going to make much better than I could, but the policy implications of winning and losing and precedent. And what would this mean? Okay, even if we're ready to give it up for now, are we ready to give up that power forever? Wouldn't there be another time in the future where we want to be able to do that? I love that complexity. And I found that the lawyers I interacted with could see both the law, but also the policy and how they interact. And that to me is a very, very special thing. And it reminds people that law, at least for me as a non-lawyer, that law, as important as it is for a service to a greater good. And when you have legal experts who can see that, it really makes an enormous difference. Let's talk about students. One of the things I've worried about, I've spent most of my life at 2 schools of public health, at Harvard and then at Brown. One of the things I worry a lot about is we're training our students to be good public health professionals in deeply blue states. That America and America's relationship with public health is far more complex than what it feels like in Rhode Island or Massachusetts. And Rhode Island and Massachusetts are important parts of America, but so are Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana, just to pick 3 random states. And one of the things we have been doing a lot of is thinking about how do we train our students to engage with a much broader swath of the American people. We hired early on the person who was running the pandemic response for the first year and a half for Governor DeSantis. Is a guy named Scott Rivkees, brilliant, really thoughtful physician. He was the Florida Surgeon General. Ultimately, he and Governor DeSantis did not stop seeing eye to eye on a lot of response things. We hired Scott to come and teach at our school because I thought it was really important to have someone who has worked with someone like Governor DeSantis be able to teach our students how to work in a very different political environment. As I said, I think that there are many things that we need to teach our students to do differently, but certainly one of them is we've got to train them to serve the public that we have across America, not just the public that some people wish we had, based on their own kind of worldview and perspectives.
So I think that's actually pretty responsive to one of the questions in the Q&A. Glenn, do you want to ask a final question for Dr. Zhao?
Yeah, Dr. Zhao, do you have time for one more? Or do
I
you
do.
want you to tell us?
I do.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent. So we had a great question about Florida, but I think you kind of addressed that a little bit. So I want to ask a question a little bit about alcohol and substance abuse and kind of the ways in which one of the Q&A participants asked this question about what we saw during the pandemic and whether this is a public health concern going forward and how to think about those kinds of issues.
Yeah, look, I'm going to broaden that up just a little bit to say the pandemic has had a whole set of profound impacts on substance use disorders, on mental health, on kind of, you know, and other much more physical health kinds of issues. That's not surprising. We've seen this in history that pandemics have these very broad impacts on society. It's easy for people who, for instance, really think that the lockdowns were a huge problem. They want to blame everything on that period of time and say that was the source of all of it. It's really complicated, right? Because yes, there was a period of time where people were socially isolated. The country also went through a period of time where 1 million people died. That has huge effects on mental health and related issues. So I think we emerged from this pandemic with a whole set of challenges. And again, to the questioner's question, specifically around substance use disorder and mental health issues, that are huge challenges. They were challenges before the pandemic began. I think it has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And a major part of the focus of public health and clinical medicine has to be to address these issues. These are just some of the fallouts of a very complicated, but ultimately pretty devastating pandemic.
Thank you so much. We know you're pressed for time, and we were so grateful for all of the time you spent with us, and again for your service and your continuing wisdom on these issues. So thank you. Please come back again, Harvard or Yale. You're always welcome.
And Abby and Glenn, both of you, thank you for putting this book together. I know there were a lot of other people involved as well. It really is a service. One last quick comment I will make is, before I left the White House, I had this conversation with a series of medical historians about how pandemics end and what the past teaches us. The recurring theme of every conversation was that as the emergency phase of pandemics end, there's an intense amnesia that sets in. This has happened in pandemic after pandemic, and there is a desire to forget. And while we all appreciate that desire to forget, capturing the lessons as you have in this book is essential if we're going to learn. So I want to say thank you to both of you and to everybody else who contributed. It's a really important service for a very long time. It will be very useful to us. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Glenn, before we have you introduce Kim, can I say a few words just to situate the book? And but I jumped ahead of that, but to get Dr. Zhao on the Zoom. I wanted to actually step in and say a little bit about the book, situate it, and also thank our wonderful friends at Petrie-Flom, Susanna, Glenn, Laura, and the whole team for being such great partners. The book actually gelled from a series of joint workshops we had back in 2020. Each of us had our own events, and we wound up combining forces and really exploring some of these issues right as they were developing. So it was incredibly exciting, and we felt that we kind of owed it to ourselves and to everybody else to put those interventions together, just as she's just said, for the future. I also want to say one other thing. The book is about COVID's legal legacy. And a lot of people think legal legacy and they think it's a tedious book about law and regulations, and it's not a book for anyone but lawyers. And while there is some capital L law in the book, you know, the point I really want to make before we launch into our further discussion is that the book is about a lot more than that. You know, law is about a lot more than just the words in a statute. Law shapes the formal and social structures that frames how we live our lives. They drive where healthcare is delivered, who gets healthcare, what kind of healthcare gets received, and it frames the nature of rights in a time of emergency. and it helps make choices about which rights are most important. And it considers questions of fairness and social justice and technology, the whole gamut. This book is about all of those things, and it's also very special because it is incredibly interdisciplinary. Although you have 3 lawyers left on this panel, the book has so many physicians contributing chapters, including prison health experts, Dr. Marcela Nunez-Smith, who was the amazing equity coordinator in the White House for the COVID response, medical experts on substance use disorder, medical internists and ethicists who led the response on the front lines in New York in 2020. And their experiences with the healthcare system during the pandemic are as much about law as the chapters that seem more capital L law may seem to the public. So with that, I will hand it back to Glenn to take over the MC duties, and I look forward to hearing Kimberly's remarks.
Fantastic. So we're so excited to have Professor Mutcherson with us. She is a professor at Rutgers. She was most recently co-dean of Rutgers, and she is one of America's leading experts on reproductive health, reproductive law, abortion, as well as health law and bioethics more generally. With that, Dean Mutcherson, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you so much. You did it again. You called me Dean, Glenn. It's got to stop. No more. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm so glad I got to hear Dr. Jaws speak as well. I also want to thank Susanna and Abby and Glenn for having me here to talk about the chapter that I participated in for this book. And so that was actually a co-authored chapter. The title of the chapter is Reproductive Justice After the Pandemic: How Personal Responsibility Entrenches Disparities and Limits Autonomy. And I wrote it with Rachel Zacharias, Elizabeth Dietz, and Josephine Johnston. So I was one of 4 authors on this particular chapter. And we wanted to focus on reproductive justice in the context of the pandemic because there were so many ways in which the pandemic impacted reproductive justice. And I want to be very clear about what reproductive justice is, because often when I say reproductive justice, what people hear is reproductive rights. And these are actually 2 very distinct concepts. So reproductive justice is a movement that was started by Black women in the mid-90s. These were folks who were activists in their communities, doing all kinds of really important work, including work around reproductive healthcare and family and parenting and all of that good stuff. And what they found was that a lot of the issues that they were dealing with and that folks in their communities were dealing with were not the issues that mainstream reproductive rights organizations were really spending time on and thinking about. And so they wanted to form a movement that would basically focus on 3 central tenets. One is the right to have a child. The second is the right not to have a child. And the third is the right to parent any children you have in safe and healthy environments. So reproductive justice is this really sort of fulsome movement that, of course, now has a sort of academic bent to it as well. And so that's really how we were rooting our chapter and trying to think about the ways in which the pandemic impacted various elements of reproductive justice. And we did that by really exploring the narrative of personal responsibility, which of course has long been a part of our political scene, in particular has been used as a way to disclaim societal or governmental responsibility for helping its citizens and helping citizens in a whole host of different ways. And certainly that kind of personal responsibility rhetoric played out a substantial amount during the COVID pandemic. And so we wanted to look at that and look at it really through a reproductive justice lens. And of course, that personal responsibility rhetoric, just to be clear, didn't start with COVID, certainly didn't end with COVID, goes all the way back to these sort of notions of pulling people, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, regardless of whether you actually have any boots. And they have long had implications that are related to race and class and gender. So everything from the Moynihan report that talked about the pathology of Black families to welfare reform during the Clinton years, which was completely focused on this concept of personal responsibility. And then, of course, we saw it as well with President Obama in thinking about the recession and who was responsible for that recession and who was responsible for getting us out of that recession. And so really that invocation of personal responsibility ends up being this way in too many cases to ignore or deny the existence of structural barriers that can't be dismantled by people simply working harder and believing in themselves more, right? The idea is always, if you're failing, it is because you're not doing what you need to do, not because there are various kinds of impediments that that the United States has put into place over a series of centuries. So what our chapter did was think about those personal responsibility narratives and shift to thinking about, well, how do we actually help people enhance their personal power, right? So rather than saying it's all up to you and, we hope you can dig yourself out of the hole, really saying, how do we put you in a position where you can live a life that is fully actualized, where you can care for yourself, where you can make the decisions that you need to make, and when you can care for your children. And so we wanted to look at certain pieces of the pandemic response that we felt were actually enhancing of reproductive justice, and then think about the lessons that potentially we could learn, maybe not putting them into play, but certainly the lessons that we could learn from some of those changes. And so in our chapter, we focused on telemedicine support for access to abortion, which was huge, remote access to judicial bypass hearings, and then paid family and medical leave. And let me talk about each of those very, very quickly. So in the context of telemedicine, what we essentially were talking about was being able to get access to medication abortion without having to go into a doctor's office. At the time, the FDA still had requirements in place that meant that you had to actually be physically in a doctor's space in order to get a prescription for the medications that are used for medication abortion. And of course, 90% of abortions in this country are first trimester, and 50% of those abortions are medication abortions. So having access to medication abortion is really critical. And taking away that need for somebody to get into a car, get on a bus, get on a train, walk, whatever it is, to get to a clinic in order to have that face-to-face meeting was significant. It was also really a sign of abortion exceptionalism in this country, right? So while we're talking about all these different types of care, where we said, of course, immediately switch to telemedicine, there were definitely attempts to carve out abortion as an exception and not allow people to access through telemedicine. But eventually we did get that, and that was really huge, and ultimately ended up changing the FDA policy even post-pandemic. And now, of course, we have a lawsuit about that. Remote access to judicial bypass hearings. So young women living in states where they either have to get the permission of their parents or notify their parents before having an abortion have at least had in the past the ability to get a judicial bypass, which means they went to court and had to talk to a judge, and the judge could give them permission to terminate a pregnancy. Again, making it so that people didn't have to go to a courthouse and do all the things that are required in order for them to do that was a very big deal for lots of young women during the pandemic. And then finally, creating better policies for paid family and medical leave, which was absolutely huge, right? We know that so many people in this country get very little time off to care for their family, or at least paid time off, and very little time off if they have medical complications. Now, none of these changes were perfect, and they actually in some ways still privilege people who already had some privilege. For instance, if you're going to do telemedicine, you have to have the technical apparatus that allows you to do that. The paid leave was limited to certain populations of people, so definitely nothing was perfect. But even so, those changes, things that were really basic and really obvious, made it more possible for people to take care of themselves and their families and to make choices about their reproductive lives and their home lives, and implement those choices with far fewer barriers. So the obvious response, of course, seeing, oh, this was successful and people did well, would be, well, let's maintain some of these things, and not only maintain them, but let's expand them so that more people have access. That, of course, is not what we did. And so as we moved out of the pandemic, rather than taking those positive lessons from these changes and entrenching them, we very quickly moved backwards post-pandemic. And of course, Dobbs, which I will talk about in a little bit, has really fundamentally shifted the landscape of abortion care. Leave policies have entrenched, and now we have lots of employers who are forcing people back into their offices, even though telework had a really big impact on people's ability to enjoy their lives. And then childcare subsidies disappeared as well, and some of the leave policies disappeared as well. And so there was this quick return to quote unquote normal, but that really ignored the fact that normal was, and really long had been, deeply, deeply flawed for many, many Americans. So I think the question that we are sort of perennially asking ourselves, and I'll leave you all with this question as well, is how do we become a country that recognizes that we all benefit when people are given the support, including financial support, that allows them to maintain a healthy standard of living for themselves and for their families, including families with children, and that we all lose when we continue to embrace an ethic of personal responsibility and not personal power that tells us that suffering is okay, right? Because some people deserve it, rather than saying suffering is something that we should all care about and try to alleviate whenever we can. So I will leave it there and await your questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I know, Glenn, you're next on our agenda, and look, do you want to take the question in the Q&A for Dean Murchison?
Yeah, why don't we ask the question in the Q&A for Professor Murchison, then we can come back. We'll have more time for Q&A, so please keep adding your questions towards the end. And I guess the question was how the fight for abortion rights relates to the fight to remain unvaccinated, and claims essentially that both of these are about life and death, both these are about bodily autonomy and integrity, and how you view these two movements, both legally and politically, as intersecting.
Yeah. So I think there's something really interesting about the ways in which people who are anti-abortion embrace some of the basic language of at least the sort of mainstream abortion rights movement, right? My body, my choice, I get to do sort of what I want. And I think there are a lot of things that are implicitly problematic about that kind of framing, right? So one piece of it is that what we were trying to do in the context of the pandemic was actually stop a pandemic. So as you're sort of walking through the world and deciding that you don't want to be vaccinated, you're potentially putting lots and lots of people at risk by virtue of doing that. And there's certainly, I would say, a selfishness to that I think a lot of us had a very, very strong reaction to. And I think that many of us think very differently about what it means for somebody to decide, not that I can create risk to other people, but that I get to decide what is happening in my body at a particular time, and how I want that to play itself out or to not play itself out. So there is this sort of sense of conscripting bodies in different ways. In a vaccine realm, what we were mostly talking about was mandates from, your employer. Your employer gets to tell you all sorts of things that you can do or not do in order to keep your job. That's kind of just the way that the world works. Schools get to tell you all sorts of things about whether you get to sit in a classroom or not, right? And the risks that you create to other people. So that kind of public health response, which I think people in this country were not very used to, interestingly, for me at least, sits very far outside of the conversations that we have about abortion rights in this country.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's my turn now, so I'll just jump in. I'm going to try to be brief. And remember, we're going to collect questions for the end. So Professor Gluck and I, and also Professor Murchison. So I'm going to talk about some chapters of the book relating mostly to the intersection of law, medicine, and ethics. Before the pandemic, there was a long and developed literature on the allocation of scarce goods like organs or treatments for Ebola. But actually, I think what was so interesting about the pandemic is we saw how this particular system interacted with the real world and the need to make decisions in real time and under conditions of uncertainty. So among the principles that are sometimes proposed are lotteries based on the philosophy that equal moral worth give rise to an equal claim to scarce resources. First come, first serve is a very common principle endorsed. The whole idea of a waiting list, although many bioethicists are deeply skeptical. Sickest first, those whose prospects, if left untreated, would be worse, should get priority, sometimes called a prioritarian view. A good counts more, ethically speaking, the less of it you have. Youngest first, age weighting. So the idea is that even if the length of life and life extension would be the same, we should prioritize those who've had fewer innings at bat, is the phrase that's often used in the youngest folks. And then principles about instrumental values, so allocating in a way that prioritizes specific individuals to enable or encourage future usefulness, so the military, healthcare personnel during pandemic, and reciprocity, which is a kind of backwards looking allocation, rewarding past usefulness, past sacrifice, or past risk. So these are pretty abstract principles. And what happened during the pandemic, and the chapters of the book reflect, is with the weight of political realities, the uncertainty about the course of the pandemic, and also about what was working, how did these play out in real life? And we saw this with ICU bed allocation, vaccine dose allocation, ventilators. And indeed, in the height of the first wave, I worked with Andrew Crespo and Doug White to get a paper into JAMA and then an op-ed into the New York Times, focusing on the question of reallocating ventilators for people who were already on ventilators, where someone who needed it more or would benefit more shows up at the hospital. And the question about whether this was manslaughter might be interpreted as such under some state statutes, and how to think about that problem and the need for really protection for healthcare workers. So in the book itself, we've got some great chapters that look at this on the domestic and also the global side. Professor Prasad and Roberts have a great chapter focused on thorny questions of what role for age and disability allocation and considering crisis standards of care, which are formalized allocation protocols for health systems during times of emergencies. And they address issues like whether persistently unconscious patients should get significantly reduced priority, how to consider future life expectancy. And they consider both the ethics of considering life expectancy, especially because certain disabilities are themselves length of life reducing. Also, the track record of how existing statutes like the Rehabilitation Act or the Americans with Disabilities Act, whether they suggest that actually it's unlawful to do so, which is a big question debated, especially in the early phases of the pandemic, as to ventilators. They also discuss proposals to set aside what they call a reserve for example, people with disabilities to try to improve access from these communities, and discuss whether, in the case of vaccines, giving priority to those who live in congregate settings or whose medical vulnerabilities preclude social distancing or masking or other self-protective interventions is justified. They consider analogies to other allocations, for example, parking spaces for people with mobility limiting disabilities. Finally, they discuss how lack of access to technology and transportation create barriers to registration and accessing vaccination, even for those who are given priority by the law. I also want to mention another chapter by Professor Yerby called Eradicating Pandemic Health Inequities, Health Justice in Emergency Preparedness. And what I love about this chapter is it takes an even broader view of the legal and policy landscape that we should be addressing and thinking about pandemics. Among other things, considering how paid sick leave rules and weaker worker protection laws exacerbate spread of diseases, not just pandemic, but now flu as well. And also, the idea of concentrated disadvantage, this idea that we have individuals who are suffering one form of social disadvantage in terms of stigma, in terms of respect, in terms of access to housing and the like, who now face it again by the medical system. My own chapter in the book called Vaccine Tourism, Federalism, and Nationalism really starts in January 2021 when people were moving to Florida in particular from within and outside the United States, take advantage of early access to the COVID-19 vaccine. And the state started objecting to doing so and making some fledgling attempts to potentially require proof of citizenship, state citizenship, which itself raised questions about whether they would be deterring undocumented individuals or people who are just skeptical of the state. I, in my chapter, try to really understand what underlies a claim for a particular individual to have access to a particular good, here, a vaccine, from that level of government, so a state or a country or a locality's share of vaccines. And I want to contrast kind of theories based on communitarian approaches, territoriality, and citizenship as what we think it is that gives people these kinds of claims. And I actually favor the more communitarian approach to the problem, which would end up permitting some of what was called vaccine tourism, but prohibit others. And really the chapter, though, pushes on the wisdom and ethical foundation for vaccine nationalism and vaccine federalism. The fact that the United States decided initially to allocate vaccines by doses by population over age 18 per capita to each state plus allowed states to have variation in their prioritization for vaccination. That's part of what caused the incentive to travel from state to state. And one questions whether that's the right level of allocation. So several other chapters focus not on distribution of the vaccines, but on the incentives to develop them in the first place. And it bears emphasizing how much of a moonshot this was to get these vaccines made and how very, very lucky we were. The first few out of the gate had huge efficacy. But while luck is a piece of it, so was government action. So a chapter by Professor Sachs, Willett, Price, and Shirkow on innovation law and COVID-19 considers both the low points, so delays in getting diagnostics to roll out due to poor interagency coordination, as well as the high points, questions about how the flexibility of FDA, the emergency use provisions that FDA used here, and really the decision of Operation Warp Speed, both to fund the research towards the end of the process rather than the beginning, but also to make these pre-commitments to purchase hundreds of millions of doses of each of the vaccines was a big point of getting this through and getting the intellectual property through. They'll also note that it made things worse when it came to our share versus our global neighbors, in that these pre-commitments made the US citizens got them first, even though there were many places that were suffering more. On the flip side, I'll just mention one more chapter by Minson, Boston, and Sinha that look at the rules about intellectual property exclusivities and intellectual property rights as to COVID-19 technologies, and show that essentially while there were some positive moves towards equity with patent pools and COVAX, for example, in reality, we didn't get that much sharing. The rich countries stayed rich and the poor countries stayed poor. And indeed, threats of compulsory licensing really failed to pass and really failed to have a lot of firepower. Okay. The last thing I want to say is where we are now. And that is to say, with a few exceptions, so modernization of CDC's infrastructure, the proof of concept of mRNA platforms, overall, my own view is we're in a worse position for the next pandemic than we were before the last. We have state powers curve, we have the Supreme Court limiting many options and skeptical about what the federal or state powers in this space can be. We have the rest of the world now seeing that wealthy countries will definitely fight for the right of their citizens first and hoard vaccines. We have a US population that is tired, frustrated, and political about public health, and much less likely to comply in the future. So my own view going forward is actually fairly dark about what the future portends for future pandemics. And I hope that that's something we can recover over the next several years. But right now, I'm worried, to be honest. And with that cheery note, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Professor Gluck.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. Okay, I'm going to get my video working. Give me a moment. Okay, I am back. I'm going to talk about a few different things by way of sort of wrapping up and teeing up some issues for Q&A. I want to encourage folks who are on the Zoom to start putting their Q&A questions in the chat so we can get to them all, in the special Q&A box, that is, so we can get to them all as soon as I'm done. So I wanted to highlight 3 different things, some of which have been mentioned briefly and some of which have not. One is what I think is the most important theme of the book as a whole. The second is to talk a little bit about a couple of the chapters I participated in. And the third is to talk about what I think is the most important doctrinal development coming out of the Supreme Court in response to the pandemic. So the first thing I want to say, though, drawing again on my own experience, is that there's an extraordinary amount of expertise in the federal government, whether you're talking about OSHA, Department of Labor, CDC, the Surgeon General, FEMA, OMB. On a daily basis, I was truly in awe. I'm so grateful for the commitment and extraordinary capacity and energy through so many months of nonstop work from amazing colleagues. And, any sort of recommendations for the future or comments on lessons lost are in that spirit of, we have an incredible infrastructure. And the question is sort of how do we build on this to prevent these losses from happening again? So with respect to that, what I think is the most important theme of the book, and certainly was the impetus from the Yale team for this collaboration, is something that Ashish actually hit on at the end of his remarks. And that is the question, what legal gaps or policy gaps in our healthcare system did COVID expose? And how have we addressed those gaps? So when we started the project, the assumption was that COVID had exposed new gaps in our system, say, with respect to poor conditions for the pandemic response in prisons, or with respect to the lack of triage protocols and workplace arrangements in large cities like New York to ensure an equitable response to a citywide emergency, or with respect to the conditions that gave rise to several 100,000 deaths of elderly people in long-term care facilities. But, on reflection, it was clear that those problems had really been there all along. What COVID did was it shined a light on those problems. And back in 2020 and early 2021, when we were starting to put this book together, it seemed like COVID made those problems impossible to ignore for the future. This was going to be the moment that we were actually going to address them. I thought that clinical ethics protocols to deal with questions like scarcity of ventilators would be implemented in New York by now. We thought that the problem of access to substance use disorder medications when in-person dispensation was possible would also be addressed. The failure of structures in place to reach doctors by telephone and video, telehealth, prison health, the health of essential frontline workers who did so much and bore such a risk, and the enormity of the impact in the early days of the pandemic. And of course, the underinvestment in the public health infrastructure, both in CDC and in the states. And this is what brings me back to Ashish's comment at the end. What is surprising and largely very disappointing is that very similarly to what happens after an episode of tragic gun violence, there's this moment of, we have to act. And then very quickly, that moment dissipates. And as much as we sort of remember the horrors, remember what we faced, we don't actually maintain the momentum to do the hard work of addressing the problems. So let me be clear. Not all of these areas, as she said, are areas that the federal government can or should solve itself. Some of these are the responsibility of the states, others are private actors. But we're arguably in no better place with respect to many of these issues that we highlighted in the book than we were in February 2020. And that's a different but as important legal legacy as the one that I thought we were going to emerge with when we started the project. There has been federal action in some important areas, don't get me wrong. We've made progress in improving access for treatment for substance use disorder. That was a step forward. It was actually facilitated by the natural experiment that was the pandemic when people couldn't go to the clinic. The same goes for telemedicine. I personally have worked for years on model state laws involving telemedicine. You could never get traction in many states with respect to providing telemedicine, how to pay for telemedicine, and years of advocacy in this area could not do what a year of 2020 could do to accelerate the adoption of telemedicine in ways that is making enormous progress and that we're unlikely to turn back from. My chapter in the book with Ryan Knox, Laura Hoffman, and Aziz Bassin tells that story. But then other chapters like Judith Resnick and colleagues, Joe Finns, Govind Prasad and Jessica Roberts, Nina Cohen, Rakaya Yerbi, they all highlight the challenges of incarceration, medical ethics, disability, essential workers, and the elderly, which I would argue we really have not addressed with any kind of satisfaction. And I think shame on us, quite frankly, if we don't set the balls in motion before the next emergency. So the second story I want to tell is something that I think hasn't really been mentioned, and it's sort of implicit in the book, but I want to make it more explicit. And that is an unsung hero of this pandemic, and that is the Affordable Care Act. The book has a terrific chapter from Andrew Hammond and colleagues and Nicole Huberfeld on the federal safety net. But what I want to highlight is something that I've written elsewhere about the Affordable Care Act, and the way in which it sort of did what it was supposed to do. It rose to the occasion, and it hasn't received enough recognition for that. So first, thanks to the Medicaid expansion, which fortunately has been adopted in all but about a dozen states, people had health coverage who wouldn't had the ACA not been passed. Second, with respect to the vaccine, and this I cannot say enough times, the vaccine was only free because the Affordable Care Act preventative care provisions made it free. The Affordable Care Act put in place a structure that allowed us very quickly to deliver free vaccines to all Americans without a wait, without having to present insurance cards. When you got online at various vaccine dispensation places. Not incidentally, the same provision that allowed the vaccine to be accessible to all of us is currently under challenge and litigation in the Fifth Circuit right now, in the Braidwood litigation. There's a challenge there to the provision of a certain medication called PrEP that treats HIV. But the provision being challenged is the exact same provision that allowed the ACA vaccines to be free. I mean, the COVID vaccines to be free. That provision is the Affordable Care Act's preventative care provisions that provide access to evidence-based preventative services without a copay, right? So when you stop and think about sort of what the Affordable Care Act did, and maybe you hear about this litigation in the Fifth Circuit, the Braidwood litigation, I hope you'll put two and two together and recognize how we took for granted in the pandemic the structure in the ACA that now feels easy to challenge because the pandemic risks are behind us. And finally, the ACA's insurance changes and its exchanges in the private sector made healthcare more accessible and more affordable. And it made open enrollment easier. As a result, since the pandemic began, more than 9 million people have gotten insurance through the private insurance system through the Affordable Care Act exchanges than they had before. That's 9 million extra people had coverage in a once-in-a-generation pandemic made possible by the Affordable Care Act. So I think one thing that doesn't come through in the book maybe as clearly as it should is sort of what I've called the unsung hero of the pandemic. So last but not least, I want to turn to a different theme and just talk briefly about the Supreme Court, which was the subject of another chapter in the book in which I participated, is also a chapter by Lindsay Wiley. So what's super interesting about the arc of litigation in the pandemic is how it traces the arc of the nature of government action. That might not be surprising, but it's very interesting. So in the early phase of the pandemic, during the Trump administration, as Ashish noted, most of the regulation was in fact left to the states. So the cases we saw were generally individual challenges to state curtailment of liberties, like access to gun shops or reproductive health care imposed by state governments. That's why those early cases involved this very famous precedent, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which for a long time has stood for the principle of deference to reasonable government actions taken in the name of public health. Jacobson was decided by the Supreme Court more than 100 years ago, before the modern rights revolution. And there were questions early in the pandemic about how Jacobson intersects with substantive rights like access to reproductive care, Kimberly just talked about, or the right to guns, or how it intersected with questions of religious freedom, which is a right that the Supreme Court also elevated, highlighted, and expanded upon in the course of its early pandemic decisions. And so those early cases out of the court raised red flags that, oh my goodness, the court's going to overrule Jacobson, and that would be a big blow to deference to expert public health measures. But just when that issue seemed teed up for a decision, the administration changed. And as we have heard, the Biden administration took a much more federal and centralized approach to the pandemic. That caused the litigation focus to shift away from individual suits challenging state action to suits against federal government action. Those suits did not implicate Jacobson nearly as often. What they implicated were the language of federal statutes and constitutional restrictions on executive action. So the Jacobson question lives for another day. But that's not to say the Supreme Court didn't then go ahead and issue another major doctrinal decision. It did. That's called the major questions doctrine, which many people in law schools in the legal world today are aware of. The major questions doctrine is a titanic change in how the Supreme Court is looking at administrative action, like most of the action taken out of the pandemic, action by the White House and its agencies. So just in brief, the doctrine emerged through a series of cases challenging the CDC's order to temporarily halt evictions during the pandemic, issued under its power to halt the transmission of disease. Studies had shown that eviction increases transmission by leading to interstate movement of homeless persons, also cohabitation and other issues. The court ultimately held that even though the CDC statute, which is 75 years old, gave the CDC very broad authority to regulate the transmission of diseases, the agency could not use it for this purpose because the question just seemed too big or too significant. That might have been a one-off case, but then the court doubled down in another pandemic case, the OSHA ETS case, saying that even though OSHA's own broad statute, which is more than 50 years old, had language that clearly allowed it to issue an emergency temporary standard to keep workers safe during the pandemic, even though the language explicitly covered that action, the idea of imposing a vaccine or test requirement, again, was too big a question of too much economic or political significance. So what the court did, and this is part of an ongoing attack on the administrative state and deference to scientific expertise that is currently proceeding on multiple fronts, whether it's the mifepristone case involving access to medication abortion, whether it's the Braidwood case involving access to preventative care, or whether it's the Loper case currently under review involving the future of Chevron deference. What the court did is essentially said that our agencies are hamstrung to use their time-tested authorities in new ways under the major questions doctrine, even if the statutory language covers the desired action. Instead, it's asking Congress to legislate specifically, with foresight decades ahead, with sort of a level of detail that is unwise and simply not possible. The thing is, the major questions doctrine did not just get cabined to the COVID context. The court quickly expanded it to the environmental context, to the student loan case, and it's now everywhere in the lower courts. It's the first line of defense for someone who's trying to attack, first line of attack for someone who's trying to challenge an administrative action. And this is the legal legacy that we are going to have to address for years to come. The irony, of course, is that the pandemic illustrated how important it was for the administration to be able to act with novelty, flexibility, and with speed. And the court's reaction to those actions by the administration will likely hamstring the next one, should it face the same challenges. So with that, I will stop, invite everyone back on the screen, hand it back to Professor Cohen to MC the Q&A.
Great. So we got lots of questions. Professor Murchison, can I ask one from the Q&A? But Professor Murchison, you haven't talked in a while, so I'll give you the opportunity. If you have a question or something you want to say, please go right ahead.
No. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So I thought one of them, I'm just going to put together a couple of the questions we got in the Q&A, and thank you, please keep them in, is the relationship between truth and divisions about the polarization of what the facts are, and the relationship of this also to artificial intelligence too, and kind of what role it might play in the next pandemic. So thoughts on either of those two topics? Does anybody want to jump in? I can talk. I mean, quite as much. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on the truth part of it. I won't touch the AI part of it. I think one of the things that was really striking throughout the pandemic, and Dr. Joss sort of talked about this as well, is this deep distrust of institutions, institutions that frankly save our lives on a fairly regular basis. And also this sort of belief that, education and experience doesn't qualify one as an expert. And that I think is really deeply, deeply problematic. And this sort of refusal to believe that there is such a thing as science and medicine and facts. And that's just not going to serve us well. I would like to think that that is a temporary thing that has to do with sort of the political state that we're living in right now, but I fear that it isn't. And I'm not quite sure how we overcome that.
Yeah, I think like expertise has been associated with big government in a way that's counterproductive, right? I think that you can be somebody who prefers a federalist system or wants the federal government's footprint to be smaller. I'm not saying I am that person, but I'm saying you can be somebody like that. And I have, views about federalism too. I think it has its time and its place and really did serve a very important role in the early months of the pandemic. But you can be someone you can disagree on the benefits of a large federal government without disagreeing that you want whatever government is running the show to be one staffed by experts who we can trust and who the public will listen to. And I think that's the salient theme that comes out in the Supreme Court's, the current cases pending before the Supreme Court, which are challenging deference to expertise on sort of every level. I think it came out with the pandemic, sort of the CDC's efforts to educate the public, sort of the massive rumor combating it had to indulge with. And I think, without going too far into AI, because I barely can use my cell phone, I would say that, which is true, just ask anyone who knows me, that I do think that AI poses that problem of, potential misinformation. And I think you're right that something we have to figure out how to address. And the Surgeon General's office, that is a primary role. Vivek Murthy is doing a fantastic job there, but, there are even court challenges to his efforts to try to educate the public. And I think that's hugely problematic.
Maybe I'll jump in a little bit more on the tech AI side. I would kind of say there's a green light, a yellow light, and a red light from the pandemic. So the green light stuff that was really good is one, kind of wastewater and wastewater analysis. This has turned out to be super helpful as a way of kind of tracking that is minimally invasive into privacy, not a little bit invasive, but also up to date, relatively easy to analyze. Also really good, and I think Professor Murchison spoke to this, is the way in which prescription related to telemedicine and telemedicine access, that we have a lot of rules that required in-person visits, and the idea that we would scrutinize this and really think carefully about it. I mean, that's the heart of some of the debates right now in Mifid-Pristone in front of the Supreme Court. So that's in the green bucket. In the yellow bucket, I would say these are like things that like were good ideas maybe, but didn't really take off. One was the ability to use smartphones to share who was vaccinated and, more importantly, who was close to infection and exposure notification, and do digital contact tracing. I think it was interesting, but actually failed, and maybe it failed because it was too fragmented. And then kind of in the red bucket, the red light, I would say, are maybe two things. One is the attempt by some countries, I'm thinking about China here, to kind of harness social credit and use that as a way of enforcing pro-social behavior in the vaccine. That's the kind of thing that worries me, the idea that like you can get on the bus, or you couldn't leave your job, or you could, essentially connected to your health status. Those kind of invasive activities worries me. And then just to pick up the last thing Professor Gluck said, and I think a lot about this when it comes to Taylor Swift this week, but also in terms of just medicine in general, the ability of AI to create medical deepfakes is just huge, so that you could flood the zone now using ChatGPT or LLMs with seemingly real New England Journal of Medicine articles showing the COVID-19 vaccine causes male sterility. And you could do that as a relatively unsophisticated person. And that's the kind of thing that I think will just increase misinformation and the idea. And this is why I think some of the stuff in the executive order on AI, watermarking, and some of the stuff in the EU AI Act is really helpful in this regard, but only if it's enforceable. All right, we might have time for one more question or one more thought. I don't know if either of the panelists want to say something or offer a question. Otherwise, I can offer a question to them. All right, well, I'll go ahead and do that. Now looking back at something you thought before the pandemic, so a belief you had about the world, about the law, or something like that, is there something that you've personally revisited in the way you think about these sort of things? And maybe, I'll start in that I think that if you'd asked me if the current, and this might be a contentious or a spicy take, if US public health federalism was well designed for the task of actually protecting the public health, I would have probably not thought that much about it or be not that much worried about it. But I do think my own view is in the wake of the pandemic, and also some of what the Supreme Court has done here, that I tend to think it's a somewhat unstable mix between state and federal and local powers here. And I probably would favor much more centralization than I would have thought before the pandemic. So, but I'll turn it over to the other two. Something else that you've changed your mind about, or that you're revisiting, or that you're still questioning now?
I think I probably should have been less naive about pushback. But then sort of thinking about, the vaccine hesitancy and all of that sort of stuff, I probably should have saw that coming. But I will say I was sort of surprised by how shocked people seem to be by how public health works, right? I mean, like contact tracing, very sort of basic things that I think people just hadn't thought about, and things that are not as invasive as people would sort of have you think. So I think that we've done a really poor job of educating people about what a public health system does and why we have it and why we should care about it. And frankly, why we should participate in efforts when our public health folks say, here's what you should be doing. And I feel like that's a thing that we could that we need to change and maybe start, in kindergarten, teaching people about public health.
So I agree with both of those comments. I think that they're spot on. I think that we talk a lot about underinvestment in public health infrastructure. We talk about underinvestment in public health in the cancer space and prevention. I think public health gets siloed into these little pockets like tobacco cessation and is not thought of as part of the healthcare system, and in the same way as, say, your insurance system is hot. And that's, partly due to Reed Polestar's famous book, and his Pulitzer Prize winning book, where he talks about, I think it's like this chapter 5 or chapter 6, where he talks about sort of the intentional siloing of the public health system. And I think we've sort of seen the repercussions of that. I would add one different topic to the list of things I was naive about or thought I knew about but didn't know enough about. And I really think the problem of long-term living institutions for elderly is a critical issue, especially given our aging population. Anyone who's had an elderly family member in one of these institutions might think, has had experiences, I certainly have, where I felt the care was not as attentive as I would have wanted it to be, but not at the level of, not having enough staff, or not giving staff sick leave, or not regulating when staff are moving from institution to institution in ways that are not having abilities for distancing, right, in isolation, and, you know, with the end result being that there was no choice but to segregate elderly families from their family for a ridiculous amount of time because there was no sort of better system in place. I think that that is a really serious issue of the coming out of the pandemic, and one that I am truly shocked that we haven't made more progress on addressing. I think people generally knew prison system has significant health challenges, and it's constantly a political challenge about how to get the momentum to engage in that reform. But I think other institutionalized populations, such as the elderly, weren't always top of mind in these conversations. And I hope as we talk about other institutional populations, we continue to talk about the elderly population, because it's just going to get bigger, and they're just going to need more places to live.
Great. Well, that's going to be our last comment for today. So just a huge thanks to my two co-panelists and to Dr. Jha, who was with us, as well as all the teams that put this on. If you enjoyed this event, there's plenty more like it, hosted by the Petrie-Flom Center and the Solomon Center, as well as our friends at Rutgers as well. So if you want to jump on our websites, you can add ourselves to our newsletters or circulars and the like. Check out our blog, Bill of Health. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Please buy the book, everybody, and read more about what you've heard. And Glenn, your whole team, thank you for being such fantastic hosts. Take care.